Hey everybody, how's it going? Today I'm going to be showing you how to do a gathered fabric texture. So thinking about folds and wrinkles in the fabric. So I'm going to go ahead and start with my 2H pencil, and I'm going to start by drawing very loosely and lightly the contours of the fabric. So I'm breaking down what I see into basic shapes and just putting them where I see them into the box. So I'm starting with this big shape towards the top. Trying to get these proportions just right can be challenging. Keep in mind that we're just practicing with adding value to create texture right now, so it's okay if your proportions here aren't 100% perfect. It's going to look like fabric regardless of making these perfect. So I'm totally ignoring the values, the highlights and shadows right now. I'm pretending they're not there and just pretending that I just see the folds in the fabric. So that is what I am drawing as outlines right now. And then some of these lines may be more obvious to you in the reference photo than others. Some lines are very crisp and clear, they have dark shadows or highlights along the edges of them, and they're really easy to see. And some of them are a little bit more subtle. It's okay as you are drawing and as you're adding value later. If you realize that you forgot to add a fold, that's fine. But in these early stages, it's best to try to find as many as you can, so that way you have a good roadmap for where to put your shadows and highlights. I think I mentioned this before, but I just want to reiterate the importance of making sure that you're drawing very lightly here. I'm using a 2H pencil, which is already very light enough as it is, but if you do press too hard, it can make it hard to erase things, but also you'll be left with these really dark outlines, which is really what you don't want when you're trying to make something look three-dimensional. So press very lightly. It's okay if your contour lines are a little bit messy, as long as they are light. One thing that I like to do to make sure that they are really light before I start adding value is I'll take my kneaded eraser and stamp onto the paper to lift off any extra graphite. Once your outlines are done, one thing that I like to do is I like to establish where the darkest values are first by going in with my B pencil or a 2B pencil. Normally, you probably remember I showed you guys how to kind of do a light coat of gray over everything first. That is absolutely something that you can do here. However, I don't want you to get the wrong impression that there's only one right way to do something. So I'm demonstrating sort of just going straight in and adding the darkest shadows first. You can do this really in any order. You could do the light coat of gray first, or you could do these dark shadows first. I kind of like to get them out of the way early in the game so that way I don't worry about losing them later. Sometimes when you do that light coat of gray, you can accidentally lose certain shapes, especially if you have very light contour lines. So this is something that may be helpful for you. So try it out. Again, I'm just taking a B pencil, or a 2B. I'm not going in with my really dark pencil just yet, because I may decide that I need to move something around, or maybe something is not quite as dark as I think it is compared to other areas. So I'm only using, at highest, a 2B pencil here. Now, as you're creating these values, really pay attention to the edge quality. A lot of these shadows are very crisp, dark shapes because they tend to be overlapped by other pieces of fabric. They're sort of being covered up and they don't get a lot of light. So they tend to be very sharp-edged shadows. Now, they're not all like that, so just be very careful and pay attention to how the edges look. Notice this piece right here has a very dark edge as it comes up against this other piece of fabric. However, that shadow becomes a soft gradient as it moves out. So those are the types of things that you want to be wary of as you are drawing. So I feel pretty confident in having established my dark area, so I think we're just about ready to move on to the next step. Once you've got your dark areas established, I like to come in with my 4B pencil and just fill in the areas that I know are the absolute darkest. These are things I feel confident about going in with a darker pencil. And it's not all of these shadows that I just created. Not all of them are 4B dark. However, parts of them are. So I'm just going in and darkening up some spots that I feel confident about darkening. So it's not going to be all of them, but it's a good few of them. So now that I've got those established, and by no means am I done completely darkening those shadows, I may go back and work on them a little bit here and there. Now I'm going to start to work on a few other areas. So I think I'm going to start by creating a very gradual shadow right here. So I'm going in with a B pencil or maybe even an H pencil, and with some really close together marks and not pressing too hard, I'm going to start to build up a gradient. Now you may notice that I'm trying to travel in the direction of the contours of the fabric. The fabric isn't just flat, it's sort of wrapped around, it's gathered, and it has a roundness to it. So I'm moving my pencil in a way that can mimic that roundness. Really think about the shape of your shadow here. If you need to go in with your eraser and adjust the shape, that's totally normal, it's part of the process. But again, think about those edges. How far out do those shadows go? How dark do they get? Where do they start to transition into some lighter areas? I'm somebody, and you're probably like me in this way, I like to work on a few different areas at a time and not really work in one set order. So I tend to jump around between darkening some things up, doing some light layers of gray. So really find the workflow that works best for you. Right here, I'm going in and darkening up this shadow that I realize I should have probably touched on earlier, but I didn't get to it. But I'm just sort of filling in some areas that I might have not hit before. So figure out what order of work works for you. Really, it's all about just building up shadows with those gradients and thinking about the shapes and the edge quality of the shadows. If you're having trouble getting your shadows to look really soft and have a nice gradient at the ends of them, one thing that I can recommend is going in with an H pencil and very, very lightly lighten up the pressure on the pencil as you get towards the edge. And that'll tend to have a natural looking gradient where things gradually get lighter as they work out from the center of the shadow. I'm pretty sure this is a tip I've given you before at some point, but another big thing that I like to tell my students is to make sure that you're not scribbling back and forth with your pencil. Pick one direction to work in, and then move that direction with the pencil, pick it up, and then start the process over again. Never scribble back and forth, or else you will get dark streaks. So moving forward, I'm just repeating the same process, going back and forth between different pencils depending on what I'm working on. So just remember what we've been talking about ever since we began this process. If you want your pencil to look lighter, use an H pencil. If you need things to be darker, use a B. And for really, really dark areas, you can go in there with your 4B and even your 6B pencil. Just keep in mind that you want to make sure that your pencil is flowing with the contours of the fabric. And if you want to create really soft gradients, use a very light touch with your pencil and go back and forth between different pencil weights to achieve the effect that you want. I would also highly recommend sharpening your pencil very often. Usually the sharper your pencil, the more control over how close together your pencil marks will look. So it's good to have a pencil sharpener on hand. Now, if you're someone like me, you like the way that blended pencil looks. However, again, I gotta tell you guys and remind you guys, never use your finger to blend, as it just does a lot of bad stuff to your paper and to your drawing in general. So if you have a Q-tip, you are absolutely welcome to use that. Or if you have one of these, what's called a tortillon blending stump, you can use that as well. It's basically just a fancy wad of paper, just like a Q-tip is. The one really big piece of advice I can give you for using a tortillon or a Q-tip is to make sure that, again, you're flowing with the direction of your pencil lines. You don't want to go against your pencil lines, or else it could just look streaky. So flow with your pencil, and then if something needs to be darker after all, you can always just go back in and darken it. And if you have a tortillon stump, you can actually sharpen it if you have one of these guys on hand. You might have one somewhere in your house. It's just sandpaper. You can sharpen your tortillon stump that way. If you're using Q-tips, just grab a new Q-tip if it gets too dirty. Just keep in mind when it comes to blending that you may not always have a blending stick or something like that on hand. So it's good to learn how to make your pencil look blended by just drawing your lines close together. Although it is nice to have a tortillon stump if you can have one on hand. So after I blend for a little bit, I'm going to just pick right back up with where I left off and continue building up my values. You can of course wait until the very end to blend, or you don't have to blend at all if you don't want to. I tend to be impatient and I want to see what things look like blended, so I will take little breaks here and there to blend my pencil together. And one thing that I like about blending is it actually will make your dark areas look a little bit darker, so it tends to amp up the contrast just a little bit. But again, that's totally up to you. Just keep in mind that you may not always have a blending stick somewhere in life while you're drawing. So again, I'm just continuing on. And you may notice that I'm not leaving any areas that I'm drawing on blank for highlights just yet. That's because I'm going to go back in with my eraser and pull out some highlights. And that's an artistic choice that I personally make. You may be somebody who wants to mark off areas where you want your highlights to be and just avoid drawing over top of them. I personally like to just add my highlights with my eraser at the end because then I can just create these nice smooth areas of gray like I'm doing right here without having to worry about drawing around highlights. So again, it's what works for you. This is just what works for me. I think one of my favorite things about fabric to draw are these sort of wave formations that the fabric creates, like this one that I'm working on right now. You notice how it sort of curls and tucks around itself, and you can take your pencil and sort of flow with the wave and the curl of that fabric. I think that that is probably one of the most satisfying things to do, is just kind of have your pencil flow along with it. So, if you can learn to enjoy the process and just have your pencil blend nice and smooth, and it's okay if it doesn't always work out exactly like you want it to. That's part of the fun of practicing here. Just let it flow naturally with the direction that those contours of the fabric are moving in. And then you can go in there with your darker values and start to really look closely at those shadows that you see in the fabric, and look at those cast shadows and the core shadows and see where they're developing and see how they blend and how they flow into each other. I just find it so meditational. So, if you learn to enjoy the process, I think you might find it very calming as well as satisfying when you're done. You can feel very accomplished with the amount of realism and the values that you have created. So here I'm just kind of jumping around so that we're not spending a whole lot of time watching me draw, but I'm just sort of adding a few little final touches to the values here, doing my best again to just recreate what I'm seeing in front of me, not worrying too much about making things absolutely perfect. Your fabric, as long as you're doing this method where you're sort of laying out the values and having them blend together, your fabric is going to look like fabric. It may not be photorealistic exactly to what the fabric looks like in the reference photo. Mine certainly isn't 100% perfect and exact, but it looks like fabric, and that's what we're going for today. So I'm just going in here with my darker pencils, taking my 4B, going in and darkening up some of those really, really dark areas. Just doing some final touches. And then I'm going to be doing one last pass with my tortillon stump, taking care to make sure I'm flowing with the direction of my pencil lines. Sometimes in really small areas you can work in little teeny tiny circles, but for the most part I like to just work in straight lines or curving lines depending on the direction that my pencil was moving in when I applied it. And now finally, last but not least, I'm going to come in and start building up some highlights with my eraser. Now this fabric isn't very reflective, so the highlights are not very solid or bright. If you were doing something like satin, that would be a very reflective fabric, so your highlights might be a little bit more sharp and defined. However, these are just very gentle, so I'm just doing a few little touches of eraser here and there. And then something that I will do occasionally with this type of fabric is after I erase, I'll go in with my blending stick and I'll soften up some of those edges of the highlights so that they're not so dramatic. Again, not every fabric is like that. Some fabrics have very, very bright, distinct highlights. Just look closely at the type of fabric that you're drawing and then do your best to mimic those highlights. I'm also cleaning up some edges here and there with my eraser, making sure that the edges are nice and clean, and well defined, because fabric is a solid thing. It may be very soft and flimsy, but it is solid. So wherever you have folds, you're probably going to have some very sharp edges. So that's pretty much it for our fabric drawing demo. I hope that this was useful for you, and I will see you guys next time.